First of all, I would like to convey the apologies of my ambassador. She couldn't attend this afternoon because she's not she's a little bit sick, but she asked me to represent her to share with you the experience of Bolivia regarding the process of liberalization that my country faced in the past. And now, taking advantage of the interpreters, I'm going to shift to Spanish para hablar.
I want to talk about the impact of liberalization of services and the possible deepening of this in the context of TISA, according to our national experience. As many of you may know, since 1985, and for about 20 years, Bolivia was one of the star pupils of the neoliberal model that prevailed and attempted to implement those policies that later on were widely known as the Washington Consensus, mainly promoted by the Bretton Woods institutions and developed countries. The Bolivian state at that time opened up its markets for goods and for many services unilaterally, and it was at this time that Bolivia also joined the WTO. And in the context of the GATS, Bolivia committed several of its services sectors, among them financial services, communication, recreation, sports, decorative services, insurance, and health, among others. The paradox is that Bolivia, in spite of following all of the neoliberal instructions, under pressure from the Bretton Woods institutions, to open its markets and take on commitments for liberalization in the services market in the WTO, the results were not good. There was no flow of investment, as the lawyers and advocates of neoliberalism had stated there would be. Very little investment that arrived went to sectors where there was infrastructure that was already developed and profits were guaranteed. But no investments and no new undertakings went to new sectors, even though they did have commitments within GATS. And many bilateral agreements protected investment. So the results went counter to what the neoliberal policies had expected, and the country entered into stagnation with a deepening of poverty and marginalization of the more vulnerable social sectors, with a generalized socioeconomic deterioration. As a result, in 2005, the people of Bolivia did an about-face and passed from the neoliberal policies that worked on behalf of the interests of transnational companies to a pro-Bolivia policy, whereby priority was established for investment and internal demand as engines of growth and development, which included nationalizing the oil sector, telecommunication services, and other strategic companies. Starting in 2006, Bolivia achieved a growth index of GDP of about 5.5% a year. Even in this year, which is thought to be, it will reach 5.3%, when the rest of Latin America will probably only grow at 2.2%, according to estimates of the international organizations. During this process, we have what we call the change process, which in January 2009 adopted a new political constitution, which states that services which are human rights, such as education, health, water, energy, and telecommunications, cannot be dealt with as commodities or objects of trade. Adopting the new political constitution of Bolivia was an extraordinary moment in the independent life of my country, because it was adopted by referendum with more than 60% support, 64% support of Bolivian people, with general turnout of 90% of the population, with significant participation by women and indigenous peoples, and this took place in January 2009. In this context, on 6th of November 2008, and on the basis of the draft which had been adopted for the new Bolivian constitution, the permanent mission of Bolivia to the WTO notified the Council on Trade and Services of its intention to withdraw its specific commitment on services for hospitals from the social services and health from the list of specific commitments in accordance with Article 21 of the GATS. This withdrawal excluded from our schedule of commitments the hospital services contained in the social service sector. The central element of the decision to withdraw the hospital from our list of commitments was due to 5 main reasons. First, to ensure that our international commitments were in line with the new political constitution, which in Article 18 states that all persons are entitled, have a right to health. It also states that the state guarantees the inclusion and access to health of all persons with no exclusion, no discrimination whatsoever. The single health system will be universal, free, equitable, intercultural, intercultural, participatory, with quality, warmth and social control. The system is based on the principles of solidarity, efficiency and co-responsibility, and is to be developed via public policies at all levels of government. So too the new political constitution of Bolivia additionally has many other provisions, which I won't go into today because of lack of time, but which have to do with the right to health as a human right. Some of this has to do with the compatibility of the health requirements and the compatibility of our commitments with national health objectives and new policies. This government has adopted new national targets for health to eliminate exclusion, social exclusion, that neoliberal policies had deepened by privatizing the sector and mercantilizing the services and the establishment of an individualistic culture of health. The present sectoral health plan has 2 basic principles: health as a human right and a fundamental social element, and not a commodity, and the state being responsible for the protection of this right. The determination of social on the basis of biology. One of the objectives in health contained in the national development seeks to eliminate social exclusion. The system seeks to be inclusive on equitable basis, solidarity. The Article 12 on social and cultural and economic rights mentions the right of all persons to the highest possible level of physical and mental health. And among the measures that need to be adopted by the states is to ensure establishing conditions that will guarantee to all medical assistance and medical services. And there are many human rights instruments similar to these provisions. The 4th reason has to do with the national position in withdrawing the basic services of health, education, water, energy and communications from GATS, because these are human rights. For Bolivia, the basic services in water, health, energy, education and communication, apart from being public services, in other words, being necessary and useful to all, are human rights that cannot form part of a private business and liberalization rules, because this inevitably leads to their privatization and the difficulty in accessibility by the population in general, especially the poorer and most vulnerable. For this reason, the Bolivian delegation on many occasions and in many fora has stated that for Bolivia it is essential to preserve and guarantee as a human right basic services as mentioned. It has also been said that WTO should start this debate in order to recognize those services that are linked to the full enjoyment of human rights as a separate category that should be completely excluded from GATS. The 5th reason has to do with the fact that the liberalization of this sector has not provided real benefits to the population, for the health of the population. None of the possible opportunities that liberalization was offering to the trade in health services has become a reality in Bolivia and has not contributed to improving quality and efficiency of health services. Quite the contrary. The study, Social Exclusion in Health in Bolivia, which was carried out by the Pan American Health Organization in 2005, arrived at the conclusion that 77% of the Bolivian population was excluded from any form of health service. In this way, keeping liberalization of trade in health would make access more difficult and accessibility to health services much more complicated for the more vulnerable and poor, as is the case of indigenous peoples. In spite of all this background, Bolivia's decision to withdraw the hospital services has not become effective on the date, because in the Services Council on the 5th of December 2008, one developed member declared it was affected by this decision of Bolivia and requested that Bolivia compensate in accordance with what is in Article 21. What is strange is that this country, or the private sector of this country, didn't put a single cent into Bolivia in this sector. The negotiations with this country are in some way at a standstill at the moment by common agreement, because this country cannot prove that it has been affected, and of course Bolivia is certainly not going to step back from its decision and is not going to compensate anybody who didn't put a single penny into the country. To conclude on Bolivia's experience, we can say that there are no relevant data that show any increase in increased foreign investment flows that are linked to or that were generated after the process of liberalization of the hospital services, and a similar situation occurred in other sectors that Bolivia opened to service providers, foreign service providers, during Bolivia's entrance into the GATS. Some of the lessons learned from this experience that could be useful in analyzing this liberalization of services in general and the TISA would be as follows. First of all, we reiterate that the trade is a means and not an end unto itself, and is obviously subject to your objectives, policy objectives, and your principles. It's also important to mention that services, in particular those related to human rights, are developed by countries because they are necessary for our population, not because they are good business, and they cannot be dealt with simply as one more business. Problems arise when the services that are considered to be businesses, and this changes the logic and the reasons for providing the service, which is not the service itself, but it is profit. And it logically condemns those who most need it, that they will probably not have access to certain essential services in order to enjoy their full human rights, simply because they haven't the money to pay for it, and are condemned to social marginalization and a decrease in the quality of their life. Developing countries need to think very hard when we look at, or when we are facing pressure to liberalize services, and this analysis has to do with development policies, developing infrastructure, promoting the growth of national providers, because when you liberalize services without due analysis, this country is denying to itself the possibility of developing key services for its own development on the basis of the concept of service for service itself. In other words, with a social usefulness, universal coverage of quality, and of course they should not be discriminatory. And to this you would have to add the relevance of the link between many services and human rights. This liberalization and deregulation scenario significantly reduces the spaces for public policy and the ability to regulate, because any change in laws and national standards, in other words, any new regulation, be it on labor issues, health, environment, tax, wages, or any other type of regulation, could be catalogued as confiscatory if it affects the benefits, the profits of companies, and could be prosecuted in different international courts, especially in following the principle that guides many decisions, at least in the case of WTO, which privileges trade interests more than other criteria such as human rights. TISA, in accordance with the information that is available and on the basis of our preliminary analysis, goes even beyond GATS. And many speakers today have said this. That is not new. It would be an initiative which in fact would not take into account many principles which are included in the spirit of GATT, such as progressive liberalization, and that the commitments should be in accordance with the levels of development. These principles are violated when you talk about approaches such as negative lists or the ratchet and standstill clauses. The negative list approach, for example, was used by some regional processes with similar levels of integration in order to open up extensive markets that were all at a similar level of development, and which would be used in the equation, the cost-benefit equation. And so the large providers would take advantage of this clause. So too the ratchet or standstill clauses in the end mean that any concession that one country makes to another, either because of geographic proximity or cultural proximity or regional integration or for any other reason, would have to be automatically provided to service providers of the rich countries, where today many of these companies receive support from their own mother companies, as we've seen with certain financial institutions in the recent past. So in conclusion, what we could say is that before one gets into commitments on liberalization, one needs to have a very deep knowledge of our own economy, our development objectives, and our key principles as a country. We would also recommend to have very high level of knowledge as how the international system is structured and what is the reality of supply of services at the world level. And here I'm talking about oligopolies and monopolies that control the majority of the key sectors that also have been mentioned here today. So we need to look at both sides of the coin from one's own perspective, and events such as this are very valuable in this analysis. Thank you.